Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Eros and Exegesis. I'm your host, Evan Francis Murray, and we're here at Chapter 8, Hegel, the Dialectic of Presence and the Completion of Metaphysics. And if you listen to our last episode, you know I promised we'd tackle Heidegger's relationship with German idealism all at once. Well, most of it. This is more about his I almost said deconstruction. His destruction phase, where he interacted with all of these thinkers on these lecture courses he gave. But to be completely honest with you, I lost it. I dove deep into Kant. I went on a massive trajectory through Schelling. And I kept throwing Hegel into the mix until, the lecture notes became an absolute monster. And this would have led to Hegel being, completely redundant. So I realized that if I kept Hegel crammed into what was part 3, now 3A, alongside Schelling, it was going to make his philosophy feel... like I said, it was just going to be like redundant, and Hegel deserves a lot more depth than that. So I made a decision, and I split things up, and here we are. So part 3A, which comprised of chapter 6 and 7 of our overarching 8-part series, is now primarily covering Kant and Schelling. And today, or now, whatever day this is you're listening to this, we're dedicating, the entirety of part 3B, chapter 8. This episode belongs strictly to Hegel. Specifically, we're diving deep into the dialectic presence and the completion of metaphysics, introducing the scholars, okay? So we're bridging the mythic and the pragmatic here. Because Hegel can be an absolute labyrinth to navigate, I've leaned heavily on some brilliant contemporary minds to help ground today's discussion. First and foremost is Terry Pinkard. In my book, he's easily the premier Hegel scholar and translator in the world. Easily. If you've ever tried to tackle the Phenomenology of Spirit, Terry Pinkard's translation, and he has reading guides. These are invaluable. His translation is like direct translation, right? Like this is like the highest scholarly translation that you can get. And also, like I said, the dialectic is not this... Pinkard grounds these things in the reality that we know, not the mythical realms, let's say. He's also he's also wrote books about Hegel as well. So, if Hegel, if you're interested in Hegel, of course, you gotta, look up Terry Pinkard. I'm also bringing in insights from Sebastian Gardner during this podcast. So if you've ever been terrified of reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, I'll give you a genuine piece of advice here. Read Gardner's walkthrough first, or read it alongside the text. He makes the inaccessible totally accessible. And what I love about both Pinkard and Gardner is that they are deeply pragmatic scholars. They are grounded in reality, not lost in purely mythical realms. And this brings me to our third ambassador, our third Hegelian ambassador, which is Slavoj Žižek. And finally, we'll be filtering some of this through the lens of everyone's favorite card-carrying Lacanian, Slavoj Žižek. And you might remember the famous debate between Žižek and Jordan Peterson a few years back. Peterson kept trying to frame Žižek as this ultimate Marxist archetype to drum up some classical debate drama. But, it was when we learned Žižek, he, as he said in later interviews, he didn't play into it. And he during the argument or the debate, whatever you want to call it, he looked right at Peterson and essentially said, like, I'm not a Marxist, I'm a Hegelian. So actually, if you want a fantastic watch, not like a contrived, circus, the ones that Peterson kind of put on, you can actually look up the video podcast on YouTube. Type in Terry Pinkard, and that's like Pinkard, Terry Pinkard, and Žižek, which is Zizek or Zizek. And you'll see them having a conversation together. There's a guy in the middle that's asking questions, but it's incredibly entertaining and very insightful. And it's, you see the admiration that Žižek has for Pinkard as well. And it's, I just thought it was great. It was a great watch. I really enjoyed it. And that beautifully sets the stage for what we're doing today. So let's peel back the layers of Heidegger's lecture series on Hegel, look at how the dialectic of presence, shapes our understanding of being, and see how metaphysics finalizes itself. So grab your coffee or your beer or your whiskey or whatever you're drinking and grab your notebooks and let's dive into Part 3B, Chapter 8. Before we go further, though, let me offer an image. And it's been haunting me through this whole project. And it belongs especially to Hegel. And I want you to consider a cartographer, what is it called? A map maker, a cartographer. And I'll probably use this example lots during my this entire Eros and Exegesis project, because a map maker, exactly, map maker. Okay, so this guy, the cartographer, he's going to set out to make a map, of a great and ancient chasm. The chasm is dark, alive with the sound of unseen water, a place where the earth itself seems to withhold its ground. The cartographer descends, he's getting in there, he's going in there now. He measures, he sketches, and over many years, he produces a map that is so comprehensive, it becomes the standard by which all later travelers understand the terrain. The map is a triumph. It shows every fissure, every ledge, every depth. But then something strange happens. Those who carry the map into the field, they find that they're no longer looking at the chasm anymore. They're looking at the map. The map has become so complete that it starts replacing the thing it was meant to guide us toward. The darkness that the map was meant to disclose has been absorbed into a system of lines and coordinates, and the chasm itself, this irreducible drop that first drew, the map maker's attention, this is quietly covered over by its own representation. So we have been tracking a similar chasm through the last several lectures. Kant glimpsed, and again, this is the Heidegger series. So this is, through Heidegger. Through Heidegger believed that, Kant glimpsed into the depths of the transcendental imagination and then retreated. And, again, you can look into Paul Guyer, who is a basically like the Terry Pinkard of Hegel. Paul Guyer is the man for Kant, along with Harry Ellison, by the way. I love Harry Ellison. And, you can read a little bit about that, the B deduction, but I don't want to focus on that here now. But again, but it's very important that you understand I'm talking from Heidegger's perspective. I'm not talking in the perspective of what I believe to be true. This is, about Heidegger, the series. So yeah, Heidegger did believe that Kant saw something, right? He got into something. Basically, he looked at the abyss. He saw that, beneath the transcendental imagination, or between, the schema that happened there, is that there was a nothingness, and when he found that, he ran away. And again, I don't think, and, most scholarship doesn't think that's what happened. The B deduction was the corrective of what Kant is, I guess, took a wrong turn. So drawing back, Kant drew back from that temporal ground that threatened to dissolve the sovereignty of reason. And we explored last episode how Schelling, plunged into it. He named it the dark ground, the ungrounded will in God. Schelling insisted that without this darkness, no light could shine and no freedom could be real. But Schelling broke apart on that very insight. His system could not hold the darkness that he had unleashed. And today, we turn to the thinker who believed he could map the chasm so exhaustively that it would cease to be a threat. So, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel did not deny the ground. Hegel didn't run from the chasm, and he didn't break on it. He denied that it remained outside the reach of reason. Where Schelling left the system fractured, Hegel set out to demonstrate that the fracture is the system's own self-movement, that the darkness is not an external limit, but the very engine of the light. So yeah, our guide to this encounter will be none other than the the guy this whole series is about, Martin Heidegger, who engaged Hegel in two sustained treatments that rank among the most penetrating interpretations of the phenomenology of spirit ever attempted. The first was the 1930-31 Freiburg lecture course, publishes volume 32 of the Gestem-Tausgabe, this massive, still ongoing collected edition of Heidegger's complete works, which now runs to over 100 volumes drawn from his lectures, notebooks, and unpublished manuscripts. And even if that ever comes to completion, it's only in German. There's no English translation of that. So, the original German's not even finished yet. And there's no date to say when it will be finished either. All right. So the second was a 1942-43 essay titled Hegel's Concept of Experience, later collected in Holzweg, a volume whose title means wood paths, and those forest trails that lead nowhere in particular and yet are walked. This is an image Heidegger used to name his most important post-war collection of essays, including The Origin of the Work of Art and The Age of the World Picture. But even before either of these, Heidegger had already taken Hegel's measure. In section 82 of Being and Time, He argued that Hegel's concept of time, for all of its, dialectical sophistication, Hegel's time still remains structured around the now as the basic unit. Hegel defines time as intuited becoming, the restless movement in which the now negates itself into the past and a new now arises. But past is still the no longer now, future the not yet now. This is the ordinary time of clocks and calendars, raised to a speculative heights, but it never fundamentally questioned. The reason, Heidegger insists, is that Hegel's entire ontology is governed by presence, because being means presence. Time must ultimately be subordinated to the eternal present of absolute spirit. At the end of the phenomenology, time is aufgehoben, canceled and preserved in the timeless now of the concept. The ecstatic temporality Heidegger had uncovered, where the future is primary and the present is the moment of vision in which future and having been meet, is covered over by the very system that claimed to think time most fully. This early critique is the seed. The 1930-31 lectures and the 42-43 essays are the tree. So in the Freiburg lectures, Heidegger did not aim to summarize Hegel or to slot him in a historical narrative. He aimed to think with Hegel, to enter the movement of the dialectic so fully that what remains unthought in that movement could rise to the surface. And in the later essay, he narrowed the focus to a single section of the phenomenology, the introduction, reading it paragraph by paragraph to ask whether Hegelian experience ever genuinely encounters what is other. And I just want to have a little pause here because the introduction of the phenomenology was actually written, you'll learn this if you read Terry Pinkard, but the introduction of phenomenology was actually written after the phenomenology was finished. So just keep that in mind, right? While we're learning about Hegel, how Heidegger read it paragraph by paragraph. He narrowed that focus to a single section of the phenomenology, the introduction, right? And he read it paragraph by paragraph, to ask whether Hegelian experience ever genuinely encounters what is other. Yeah. So the peak, he goes to the peak of the mountain and he goes, okay, this is what we're looking at here. Together, these texts, the two essays or the writings, the lecture and the writings, these texts form a confrontation that goes to the very heart of what philosophy can claim to know. Heidegger looked at the map Hegel had drawn and asked the question we are going to sit with today. What if the map just doesn't describe the chasm, but what if it makes us forget it? What if the completion of metaphysics is also its deepest concealment? We will need to move carefully. First, we're going to lay out what Heidegger actually argued in those lectures in that essay, the claim that Hegel completes the metaphysics of presence, that he obliterates the ontological difference, and that his concept of experience never genuinely encounters what is other. Then we will step back and let three powerful contemporary voices, this I mentioned before, Terry Pinkard, Sebastian Gardner, and Slavoj Žižek, test whether Heidegger's readings hold. Because the question here is not merely historical. It is whether the chasm can be mapped without being lost. So whether reason can think its own ground without turning that ground into just another thing for reason, that question is alive. And it has consequences for everything we mean by truth. So Heidegger began his 1930-31 lectures with a disarmingly simple move. He asked his students to consider what Hegel means by the term being. The Phenomenology of Spirit is famously a work about knowledge, about consciousness and its shapes, about the long education of what we call spirit. The development of consciousness, basically awareness in the person, right? And how the person becomes. So Heidegger, however, insisted that the work is from start to finish an inquiry into being, even if Hegel never says so in those terms. What Hegel means by being, Heidegger argued, it corresponds to what he himself calls Vorhandenheit. That's the presence at hand, the mode of being of objects that are simply there for a detached inspection. This is where the hammer breaks, right? So Vorhandenheit, we're using something like the keyboard, it's seamless. We stop paying attention to what the keyboard is made of as we're interacting with it. We don't see the hammer as, metal and wood and what it's made of. We just see it as a tool. And when we use it, we actually, it actually it molds itself, it flows itself into our consciousness, into our awareness. We lose sight of it, let's say. Of course, we know we're using it, but we know it in an ethereal way. We're not thinking about the hammer. If the hammer breaks, if the keyboard breaks, like we see the wood in the hammer, we see the metal. If I'm using the keyboard and all of a sudden it just stops working, I'm thinking about the circuitry, I'm thinking about the plastic mold, that's the present at hand. So Heidegger argued, corresponding that Hegel was, writing about this Vorhandenheit, present at hand, of the mode of being of objects. And this is a strong claim. Hegel's dialectic is nothing if not dynamic. It is a restless movement of negation and sublation. How could such a movement be grounded in something as static as present at hand? And Heidegger's answer is that the dynamism of the dialectic unfolds entirely on the unexamined ground of this understanding of being. The dialectic moves from one shape of consciousness to the next, always driven by the inadequacy of what consciousness takes to be true. But the very space in which this movement occurs, the space of what can appear for a subject, of what can be present, it's never itself questioned. Consciousness encounters objects, finds them wanting, and transforms its own standards of knowledge. But that there are objects at all, that there is a clearing in which anything can show up, that being itself grants presence before any particular being is present. These questions do not arise, and they are unthought. I guess we could call them the unthought element in which the entire drama takes place. It's also interesting to note, too, Hegel does use the word Dasein as well inside of his writing. Again, I guess that's kind of a common German, wording for something being somewhere. All right, so this reading culminates in Heidegger's treatment of absolute knowing. At the end of the Phenomenology, spirit recognizes itself in all its forms, and the distinction between subject and object is overcome. This is the moment of self-transparency, where nothing remains outside the concept. For Heidegger, this is not a breakthrough, but an exhaustion. Absolute knowing is the point at which being has been reduced without remainder to presence. And the question of being, what it means for anything to be at all rather than not to be, has been quietly sealed shut. The history of philosophy, which since the Greeks has understood being as presence, here achieves its final shape. There's nothing left to think. Essentially, Hegel brings us to this place, where he's just like, because everything thinkable has been gathered into the self-knowing of spirit. So the map has covered the chasm so perfectly that the chasm is no longer visible, even to the map maker. This brings us to the second and more radical claim, that Hegel obliterates the ontological difference. The phrase ontological difference, this names the distinction that Heidegger placed at the center of all of his thinking. The distinction between being, that's the backdrop of everything, being, and beings, like us. Beings are the things that exist: tables, trees, people, numbers, historical events. But being, that's with the capital B, is not a thing. It is that on the basis of which beings are able to be as the beings they are. So, like I said, the backdrop of existence. Being is the event of disclosure, the clearing, the meaning that lets things show up. The history of metaphysics, Heidegger argued, has been the history of the forgetting of this difference. Philosophers have always asked about the highest being, the most real being, the ground of beings, but they have mistaken that for the question of being itself. Hegel, on Heidegger's reading, is the thinker who brings this forgetting to its most rigorous completion. As the scholar Alon Sagiv has sharpened the point, Heidegger charges that Hegel tries to reduce everything to a single absolute entity, the absolute knowing subject. The result is the famous opening of Hegel's Science of Logic, where being and nothing are identified. Hegel argues that pure being, without any further determination, is entirely empty. It is indistinguishable from nothing. And yet this identity is not a dead end. It generates the category of becoming. Being passes over into nothing, and nothing passes over into being. And this restlessness is the first concrete thought. Heidegger does not simply disagree with this. He agrees that being and nothing are the same, but he agrees for an entirely different reason. And the difference between these two reasons is the whole matter. For Hegel, being and nothing are the same because being, as the most abstract category, has no determinations and therefore collapses into its opposite. For Heidegger, being and nothing are the same because being, that's the backdrop of existence, is not a being. Only beings exist. Being itself does not exist. It is not a thing you can point to. It's not an entity alongside other entities. And since being cannot be in the way that a table or a tree can be, it is, from the perspective of beings, nothingness. But this nothing is not an emptiness, okay? It is the very event of clearing that lets beings be. So it's the stage, right? It's the backdrop, it's the stage. And the beings are like the props on the stage. I guess this is a way that you can kind of picture it. Hegel's nothing, so when we talk about nothing, Hegel's nothing is the logical negation of abstract being. Heidegger's nothing is the withdrawal, So the pulling back that makes presence possible. The first is a category. The second is the truth of the ontological difference. I talked about withdrawal in the introduction a lot. So just to recap that, I see a mountain. Now a mountain is many things, but the thing is, as I call it mountain, as I see rock, like I stop experiencing the mountain as a totality. I stop experiencing it as a 100% of this essence. And when I do that, that's the mountain withdrawing. Okay. That's the being of the mountain withdrawing. Just to intellectualize that so we can just kind of picture things as we go here. When Hegel identifies being and nothing, he absorbs the difference between being and beings into the self-movement of the concept. Being becomes the most impoverished category, the starting point that must be negated and enriched. The fact that being is not a being, so the fact that the stage is not one of the props on the stage, that it never shows up as an object for consciousness. This is treated as a deficiency to be overcome by the dialectic. But for Heidegger, that deficiency is precisely what needs to be thought. You see, being's withdrawal is not a flaw. It is the condition of anything appearing whatsoever. So in Heidegger's view, it's like if being the backdrop, the thing that we're all existing in, I guess you could, it would be like Kantian space. If there was no differential, if nothing withdrew, if we didn't start particularizing things, everything would just be, a part of totality. There'd be nothing to really observe. Yeah. So again, Heidegger thinks being's withdrawal is not a flaw. It is the condition of anything, to appear. So by making being into the first and emptiest category, Hegel renders the ontological difference invisible and then erects an entire system on that invisibility. The map does not just cover the chasm. It convinces us there was never a chasm, only a flat line that needed to be drawn. Okay, so the third claim that Heidegger develops most fully in the 1942-43 essay, Hegel's Concept of Experience, this concerns the nature of experience itself. Hegel's introduction to the Phenomenology describes experience as the movement by which consciousness examines its own knowledge. Consciousness has an object that it takes to be the truth, the in itself. But when consciousness measures its knowledge against this object, it discovers an inadequacy. The object does not match what consciousness took it to be. Both the knowledge and the object are transformed, and a new object arises for a shape of consciousness. This is the dialectical path, and Hegel calls it the path of despair. But at every stage, consciousness loses what it thought was true. Heidegger's question is deceptively simple. He asks, what makes this movement possible? What drives it? That would be the negative, the inadequacy. But what is the open region in which anything like an encounter between consciousness and its object can take place at all? For consciousness to measure its knowledge against an object, there must be a space of appearance, a clearing in which the object can show up as something and the knowledge can show up as possibly inadequate. Hegel never asks about this clearing. He presupposes it. The entire phenomenology takes place within the clearing. But the clearing itself is never a shape of consciousness, never a moment in the dialectic. It is the unthematized horizon within which every shape of consciousness arises and passes away. The consequence, Heidegger argues, is that Hegelian experience never genuinely encounters what is other. The other that consciousness meets, the object that resists its knowledge and forces a transformation, is already an other for consciousness. The resistance is a resistance that consciousness can recognize, a deficiency it can measure, a negativity it can incorporate. The object never shows up as a simply strange, as an excess that cannot be measured, as a withdrawal that refuses to be made into a moment of spirit self-recovery. Otherness is always pre-inscribed as the other of consciousness, destined for sublation. The sting of alterity is drawn in advance. What Hegel cannot think on this reading is another other that remains other. A darkness, it is not the dialectical opposite of light, but the ground from which light itself emerges and to which light owes its own possibility. That is the heart of Heidegger's critique. And it returns us to the chasm that Schelling named and that Kant supposedly fled. Hegel appears to have mapped the chasm, to have shown that the dark ground is nothing but the negative moment of the concept's own unfolding. But Heidegger's charge is that the mapping has covered over the ground it claimed to disclose. The clearing that lets beings appear. Being itself is not a being, not a concept, not a moment in a logical progression. It is the event that gives all logic its space. And that event in Hegel's system, it remains unthought. At the beginning of this Hegel lecture, or should I say this Heidegger lecture on Hegel, we had the parable of the map maker, the cartographer. But you see, with Hegel's system, the cartographer drew a map so total that the darkness beneath his feet disappeared from view. He mapped it so well, not because it was explained, but because the very act of explaining had covered it over. Now, if we left the matter here, we would have a powerful critique, but also a suspicion that something has been settled too neatly. Philosophers do not submit to being summarized. I think that's obvious. Anybody that puts their life into their thinking and writing and editing, they're not going to submit to being summarized and dismissed. And Hegel least of all. Over the past several decades, a range of scholars have pushed back against Heidegger's reading, not simply to defend Hegel as a historical figure, but to ask whether Heidegger's own framework forced him to miss something that Hegel was actually doing. So this is where I guess some people have thought that Heidegger's codex, this way of, being in the world, the way that he sees time and all of these other things, has actually worked against him in this way. And three of those voices, as we mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, are Terry Pinkard, Sebastian Gardner, and Slavoj Žižek. And they're going to help us see what's at stake here. So I'm going to start off with Terry Pinkard here, and I just kind of want to make a side note, as we're going through this Heidegger series, it's not because I always agree with Heidegger, like I'm just trying to present the facts. And I said earlier, and I'll stick by this, is I don't believe anybody really knows Hegel as well as Terry Pinkard does, from my experience of reading anyways. Anybody I've heard make commentary on Hegel, I mean, Žižek makes him reduces him and makes him incredibly interesting at the same time. But I mean, Terry Pinkard articulates Hegel, and not only in a compelling way, but like I said, a very pragmatic and realistic way. So, um, you know, Terry Pinkard's reading is, I mean, I would definitely, listen to and advocate over Heidegger's, let's say, more, I guess, elaborate, I guess, more creative way of understanding Hegel. Um, you know, for instance, Terry Pinkard in his 1994 book, Hegel's Phenomenology, the sociality of reason. Oh my God, sociality of reason. It offered a reading of the phenomenology that stands in striking contrast to Heidegger's. Pinkard does not set out to refute Heidegger directly, but Pinkard's interpretation foregrounds exactly the dimension of Hegel's thought that Heidegger's reading sidelines, and that's the social and historical embeddedness of reason. For Pinkard, the phenomenology is the story of how consciousness repeatedly fails when it tries to ground knowledge in its own individual certainty, and how it is driven to recognize that reason is a shared social achievement. The truth does not emerge from a solitary subject measuring itself against an object. It emerges from the complex historical institutional practices by which communities establish and revise their norms of justification. And I mean, I definitely think Pinkard is right here. This is the Geist, right? Like Hegel wrote about Geist, the spirit. Like, if you think about water, like water is a thing, but it's made up of infinitesimal things. This is like, a person embedded in a society, in a culture. If Pinkard is right, then Hegel is not the pure metaphysician of presence that Heidegger describes. Absolute knowing is not a cosmic self-transparency in which all otherness is dissolved. It is the achieved self-consciousness of a historically situated form of life that has come to understand the conditions of its own normative authority. The movement of the dialectic is not the internal logic of a world spirit. It is the social process by which reasons are exchanged, found wanting, and transformed. The presence that Heidegger critiques, the dream of full self-presence, it may be a projection of Heidegger's own ontological commitments rather than a finding from the text. Pinkard's Hegel is a thinker of finitude. Pinkard's Hegel is a thinker of finitude, not its erasure, of historical contingency, not its sublation into eternity. Sebastian Gardner has developed a more focused critique of Heidegger's interpretive method. In a series of essays, Gardner has argued that Heidegger's reading of the phenomenology presupposes the very start that the work adopts, the standpoint of absolute knowledge. Heidegger treats the phenomenological observer, the we that Hegel invokes in the introduction, is already in possession of the truth toward which the shapes of consciousness are striving. The entire examination of consciousness then becomes, in Heidegger's hands, not a genuine itinerary, but an unfolding of what was always already known. The result is that Heidegger reads the phenomenology backwards. the charge of presence, the claim that Hegel reduces being to its presence at hand. This is built into a hermeneutic starting point rather than discovered through a patient engagement with the text. And if Gardner is right, then Heidegger's Hegel is a construction, a figure designed to play the role of the culmination of metaphysics, so that Heidegger's own thinking can appear as the new beginning. The critique does not invalidate Heidegger's questions, but it forces us to ask whether Hegel's own text might resist the role Heidegger assigned to it. And I think it's really important, again, I mentioned this earlier, that we remember that, strangely enough, what Gardner is saying here, that Heidegger kind of reads Hegel backwards, like, Heidegger's already in possession of all this knowledge that Hegel's going to carry forth while he's examining, the introduction. And like I said, it's really important to understand that, strangely enough, Hegel did write that. The introduction, what was it? No, is it the preface? Yeah. Hegel did write that after he finished the book. So there's some things to think about here. And, we have to move on to also, let me look at my notes here. Yes. Then there's Slavoj Žižek. Okay, so who cuts across, this is a guy, he cuts across both Heideggerian and the Hegelian camps in a way that few others have attempted. Žižek takes Heidegger's critique of the metaphysics of presence with the utmost seriousness. He agrees that the Western tradition has been governed by the dream of full presence, and that this dream is a kind of avoidance. But Žižek turns the critique against Heidegger himself. He argues that Hegel is more radical than Heidegger on precisely the point that Heidegger thinks is decisive: the status of negativity and the ontological difference. Žižek points to us a passage that rarely appears in Heidegger's treatments, and the section of Hegel's Philosophy of Spirit where Hegel describes what he calls the night of the world. Hegel writes of the human subject as a pure negativity, an abyss of nothingness into which the entire world of determinate content sinks and disappears before any new world can be constituted. This is not the orderly negativity of the dialectic, the negation that is always already destined for sublation. It is a madness, a radical dissolution that no conceptual framework can contain. For Žižek, this is the true Hegelian counter to Heidegger. Hegel does not reduce being to presence. He thinks the void at the very heart of presence, the crack in the ontological edifice, that is not a moment of spirit self-recovery, but a permanent condition. The ontological difference, the gap between being, the backdrop, the everything, and being, so the gap between that stage and the things on the stage, is not overcome by Hegel. Essentially, it is radicalized by him, because Hegel sees that the difference is internal to being the backdrop. We're talking about the backdrop now, the big B, okay? Difference is internal to being itself. Being is not a stable ground that withdraws. It is the split, the antagonism, the impossibility of ever achieving full self-identity. On Žižek's reading, it is Heidegger who retreats. Heidegger's insistence on finitude, on the event of appropriation, on the need to let being be. This is kind of a quietism, a refusal to think the full force of the negative that Hegel already thought. Heidegger replaces Hegel's abyssal subject with a da sign that is thrown into a world that projects itself towards death. But that Dasein never faces the radical self-relating negativity that Hegel placed at the core of subjectivity. Gelassenheit. This is generally translated as releasement. This is a key word of Heidegger's later thought. Indeed, it names something less than the fundamental attunement with which he says human beings are so authentically, related to other beings and to being itself, the big B of being itself. This contrasts with the fundamental attunement, or rather disattunement of the will. This releasement that Heidegger later recommends is not a break with metaphysics, but an escape from its own disturbing insight. The chasm, Žižek would say, is not covered by Hegel's map. It is inscribed in the map itself, in the map's own impossibility of coinciding with the terrain. We find ourselves then not with a settled account, but with a living dispute. Heidegger claims that Hegel completes metaphysics and forgets the clearing. Pinkard claims that Hegel is a social pragmatist, not a metaphysician of presence at all. Gardner claims that Heidegger's reading presupposes its conclusion. Žižek claims that Hegel outflanks Heidegger on the very ground of negativity and that Heidegger's critique is itself a form of avoidance. Each of these positions is defended with the serious textual and philosophical arguments, and each reveals something that the other miss. What Heidegger collected from Hegel, despite the force of these counter-arguments, it still remains philosophically potent. Heidegger recognized in Hegel the most powerful articulation of what it means to think being as presence. And he recognized that this articulation was not a mistake, but an achievement. The dialectic is not a failed theory. It is the most rigorous form that the metaphysics of presence has ever taken. Anyone who wants to understand what philosophy has been, Heidegger believed, must work through Hegel. There is no way around him, and anyone who wants to ask whether philosophy can think something other than presence must first understand what presence thinking looks like at its zenith. Heidegger also collected from Hegel the recognition that negativity belongs to the essence of the real. The labor of the negative is not an external obstacle that thinking must overcome. It is the innermost dynamism of what is. This insight, which Schelling had glimpsed in the dark ground, but could not sustain, Hegel raised to the level of a rigorous logic. Heidegger would never forget it. His later thinking of concealment, of the withdrawal that beings, belongs to every emergence, of the refusal that is not a deficiency, but a granting. All of this is unthinkable without Hegel's demonstration that negation is not nothing but a power. Even as Heidegger turned against Hegel's sublation of negativity, he preserved the Hegelian insight that the negative is real. And Heidegger collected from Hegel the model of a thinking that takes history with full seriousness. Hegel was the first thinker to understand truth itself as having a history. The shapes of consciousness in the phenomenology are not a list of opinions that have been held. They are the itinerary of spirit's self-education, a narrative in which each shape is necessary and each transition is a genuine advance. Heidegger's own history of being, his narrative of the epochs of present from Anaximander of Miletus to Nietzsche. It takes its formal possibility from Hegel's precedent, even as it opposes its content to Hegel's conclusions. The idea that philosophy could be historical without being merely relativistic, that the history of thought is the unfolding of truth itself. This is a Hegelian inheritance that Heidegger never disowned. But the most important thing Heidegger collected from Hegel was the recognition of a limit. Completion is not the same as overcoming. It is fulfillment. Hegel's system on Heidegger's reading leaves no outside. It is the closure of total presence. And that closure is what Heidegger will call the end of philosophy. This does not mean that philosophers will stop writing. It means that the innermost possibility of philosophy, that's the thinking of being as presence, it has run its course. After Hegel, the task is no longer to build a better system, a more comprehensive metaphysics. The task is to learn to think what metaphysics could not accommodate. The clearing itself, the event of disclosure that is not a being, the granting that lets presence be but never becomes present in its own right. This is the point at which Heidegger's own path turns, and it is the point we will need to follow in the lectures to come. But for now, let us hold the Hegelian questions open. The map that covers the chasm, is it a triumph or a concealment? Or is the truth more unsettling still, that the chasm is not covered by the map, but is the map's own condition, the void at the heart of every representation, the withdrawal that makes all drawing possible? Heidegger, I don't know. I mean, Hegel thought he had shown that the negative is always already the motor of the positive, that reason can digest its own ground. The voices we have heard today, Pinkard, Gardner, Žižek, and above all Heidegger, I mean, this suggests that the matter is not settled, and that perhaps this is the most Hegelian outcome of all, a contradiction that refuses to be resolved, a dialectic that does not close, a thinking that must begin again, but there has to be somewhere where this actually ends. I mean, Hegel's entire philosophy was about the absolute. And I want you to leave you with my own assessment here, because after spending months inside of these texts, I believe something important gets obscured when we read Hegel exclusively through Heidegger's lens. And I do think that Pinkard, more than anyone else we've discussed, I truly think he puts his finger on the problem here. Heidegger saw Hegel's dialectic as the most ambitious attempt in the Western tradition to think the whole of reality through the movement of the concept. He did not dismiss it. He took it with the seriousness it deserves. But he believed that in Hegel's hands, the living event of being, the fact that anything shows up at all, and that this showing up is a gift that can never fully be accounted for, it gets transformed into a moment within a system. The dialectic explains how things become, how they pass over into their opposites, how spirit comes to know itself, but it never asks what makes the movement possible in the first place. The clearing, the open region, the simple mystery that there is something rather than nothing. That mystery, Heidegger argued, cannot be captured by any logic of becoming, no matter how supple. And when a system claims to have captured it, the mystery is not solved. It is forgotten, I guess, lost throughout all these happenings. And the cost of that forgetting that Heidegger believed is not just philosophical, it is historical. A world that inherits Hegel's closure without Hegel's depth, becomes a world that treats everything as available, calculable, a standing reserve for human purposes. Heidegger reached back past Hegel, past the entire tradition, toward an older openness, what the pre-Socratics had glimpsed and what he would later call erogenous, because he believed that without that openness, thinking itself becomes a kind of machinery. That is a powerful critique, but here's where I think we need to be careful. Hegel's phenomenology is not an individual ontology. The consciousness that undergoes the path of despair is a placeholder for spirit itself, the collective, historically unfolding shape of human self-understanding. Hegel's subject is the I that is we. The progression through time is not the story of a single person achieving absolute knowing. It is the story of how communities, institutions, and entire forms of life educate themselves through conflict, failure, and mutual recognition. When Heidegger reads the phenomenology as if it were describing a solitary absolute subject confronting inert objects, he is already interpreting a collective movement through the lens of an individual ontology. And that, I believe, is a category mistake. It's a categorical error to put Hegel's system inside of Dasein. Heidegger's Dasein is irreducibly singular, like it's a species, that's caught in this moment. It is always in the mine, Anxiety singles me out. Death is non-relational. The entire analytic of Dasein is, in a certain sense, an ontological examination of presence and essence as the quality of a human life at any given moment, the totality of what it is to be, caught as if in a freeze frame. There is something almost anatomical about it, as if we removed the black box from a being that has stopped existing, stopped cultivating, stopped evolving, and tried to explain its internal framework, the way it experiences the world. This is not a criticism of Heidegger. I mean, this is in contrast. It's a description of what his method does, and it is precisely what allows him to uncover the structures of thrownness and projection and fallenness with this surgical clarity. But you cannot examine Hegel's phenomenology through that same lens without distorting it. Hegel is not doing an existential analytic. He is doing a historical phenomenology. His subject is the movement of spirit through time, the forming and reforming of collective self-consciousness. This is not an ontic examination of a frozen moment. It is the story of how moments are generated, shattered, and reassembled. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're sitting at a chessboard. Hegel's project is like studying how the game was, first conceived, how it was invented, like how the rules developed, how each strategic innovation transformed what the players could see, what they could do, how the entire history of chess is like this process in which every move is not an isolated action, but part of a larger unfolding, like a evolution, and how in the limit, the game, might one day completely solve itself. It's logical, fully transparent. Like we see the game for what it is and know exactly what we would do to win the game without having to, defer to all of these options we had while, developing our insights about how the game should be played. Heidegger's project is completely different than this. He's not asking how the game was invented. He's asking what it is to be in the game right now, what it means to play, to win, to lose, the value of having more pieces than the other person, the condition of your hands on the pieces, the mood in the room, the stakes that make the game matter at all. I mean, both are very real observations. Both are philosophical, of course, but they're asking fundamentally different questions. And you cannot fault Hegel for failing to do what Heidegger does when Hegel was never trying to do it in the first place. And that is why, after all the arguments and counter arguments, I find myself returning to Pinkard, his Hegel, the philosophy of social reason, of historically situated normativity, of the long, painful education of collective life. It seems to me closer to what the phenomenology actually does. And that does not mean Heidegger is wrong about the metaphysics of presence. It means his critique may land on a Hegel of his own construction. A Hegel read backwards from absolute knowing as if the entire journey were already contained in its endpoint. A Hegel stripped of the very historicity and sociality that makes the dialectic something more than a logical machine. It's like we're saying, if we were to say time doesn't exist, all time is in one frozen event. That's how Heidegger sees Hegel. Yeah, and I think Žižek's counter critique that Hegel is more radical than Heidegger on the very ground of negativity, I think that deserves more attention than we could give it today. Žižek is, after all, the thinker of the parallax, the irreducible gap between perspectives that no synthesis can close. His book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, opens from its very preface to the second edition with a density that rewards sustained engagement. And his reading of Hegel through Lacan is one of the few that genuinely unsettles the Heideggerian narrative. I would invite anyone who has deeper insight in Žižek's understanding of Heidegger's Hegel to stoke that fire. The conversation is obviously far from finished. But here's where the trajectory leads. The question passes to the individual who must actually exist inside the wreckage. It passes to Kierkegaard, who looked at the same abyss that Schelling named and Hegel systematized and concluded that the truth is not a system at all. It is a decision, a leap, a moment of fear and trembling in which the single existing individual stands before God with no guarantees at all, no dialectical safety net, no historical process to catch them. And it passes to Nietzsche, who saw the completion of metaphysics not as absolute knowing, but as the death of God, an event that dissolves every foundation and leaves the will facing nothing but its own abysmal freedom. That is where we turn next in part 4. Anxiety and the completion of nihilism. We will take up Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche together, not as a tidy pair of proto-existentialists, but as two thinkers who most fully inhabited the collapse of the idealist project. They're the ones who asked what it means to exist when the map has been torn up, when the game is still being played, and when no collective spirit can substitute for the terror and responsibility of the single human being. This is the next stage in Heidegger's deconstruction of the tradition, and it is where the question of being becomes inseparable from the question of what we are willing to face.